I put on the deep red silk gown he bought for our 30th anniversary and stood in the hallway staring at my reflection longer than I should have, not because I was admiring the dress. Not because I was nervous about seeing 300 people packed into a ballroom to celebrate my husband. I stood there because something felt wrong and I could not give it a name. The house was too quiet. The air felt too still. On the passenger seat of my car sat a wrapped gift box with a fountain pen inside. A vintage piece Arthur and I had admired years earlier in a tiny antique shop while we were still the kind of couple who finished each other's spots and shared private smiles across crowded rooms. I had gone back for it the week before. Had the date of his promotion engraved on the clip. Had imagined placing it in his hand after the speeches were over and watching his face soften the way it used to when success felt like something we had built together. I truly believed that when I left the house that night, I was driving toward one of the proudest moments of our life. Instead, I drove straight into the moment that proved my husband had already erased me from it. Less than 30 minutes after I walked through the doors of that hotel, 2 security guards escorted me back out, while 300 people watched in silence. I did not scream, I did not cry, I did not beg anyone to explain. I walked with my shoulders straight, and my hands steady, and when I got into my car, I sent one text message. By the time I pulled out of that parking garage, the first pieces of my husband's perfect new life had already started to come apart. My name is Eleanor Sterling, and for 34 years, I believed I was building a marriage. I believed I was building a family. I believed I was building a company with the man I loved. What I was really building was a kingdom for a man who had quietly decided there was no room for me in the story anymore. And the worst part is this: the signs had been there. I just kept calling them sacrifices because that sounded nobler than calling them what they were. The first years with Arthur had never been glamorous. People hear the name Sterling Freight now and think of polished offices and framed awards and fleet numbers, and corporate dinners where everyone laughs a little too hard at executive jokes. They imagine a smooth climb. They imagine a plan. They imagine Arthur as the brilliant founder who saw the future before anyone else did. That is not how it began. It began with one rented office above a tire shop that smelled like rubber and coffee burned all day on a hot plate. It began with a second-hand desk that wobbled every time I typed. It began with one dented truck that stalled in cold weather, and a filing cabinet that stuck so badly I had to yank it open with both hands. It began with overdue invoices and exhausted prayers, and the kind of fear you swallow because if you say it out loud, it might become real. Arthur was good with people. He always had been. He could walk into a room and make strangers feel like old friends within 10 minutes. He brought in clients because he knew how to make them feel seen. He knew how to flatter without sounding insincere. He knew how to talk about the future in a way that made everyone believe it was already on the way. I was the one who made sure we survived long enough to reach it. I handled the bills. I chased late payments. I called vendors before sunrise, asking for extensions we did not deserve. I typed invoices after dinner and balanced numbers at the kitchen table while Arthur slept on the couch with his arm over his face. There were weeks when I stretched grocery money farther than numbers should allow, and months when I told my mother we were doing just fine, because I did not want the look in her eyes that says, "I told you so," without words. When the biggest client we had folded in 1998 and left us hanging with debt we could not cover, Arthur sat on the edge of our bed and looked smaller than I had ever seen him. He said it was over. He said he had dragged me into a dream that was never going to happen. He said he was sorry. The next morning, I sold the stock my father had left me. It was supposed to stay mine. A quiet inheritance. A piece of security I never touched. My father had told me to keep it for the day life turns without warning. I remember signing the papers and thinking that was exactly what I was doing. Protecting our future. Saving the company that would one day support our family. When I handed the money to Arthur, he cried. He sat at the kitchen table with both hands over his face and cried like a man who had just been handed another life. Then he took my hands and told me the world would know what I had done one day. He promised me. He said no matter how big the company got, no matter how many people worked for us or how many offices opened, he would never let anyone forget who kept the doors open when everything was about to collapse. I believed him. And for years, I never once asked myself what promises sound like when the person saying them has already started forgetting, People talk about betrayal as if it arrives in one moment. One scene. One shocking confession. One lipstick stain. One hotel receipt. One terrible sentence that splits a life in half. That is not how it happened to me. Betrayal arrived slowly. Quietly. So quietly. So quietly that if you had looked at our life from the outside you would have called us lucky. As sterling freight grew, my role changed shape. That is how I explained it to myself. Arthur handled strategy and expansion and investors while I stepped in and out where I was needed most. When his father had a stroke, I was the one who took him to appointments and learned how to help him button shirts with one working hand. When our daughter Natalie had twins and tried to return to work before her body and heart were ready, I became the grandmother who packed lunches and buckled car seats and waited outside daycare with snacks in my purse. My name is stopped working for the company. I just became useful in ways that never showed up in annual reports. I hosted client dinners at our house. I remembered employee birthdays. I sent flowers to grieving families before anyone in management thought to ask for an address. When a dispatcher's husband died, I sat with her through the funeral and made sure payroll did not dock the week she missed. When a driver had a daughter accepted into college and could not afford the deposit, I quietly covered it through a scholarship account. Nobody knew I funded. I knew the names of spouses and children and dogs. I knew which warehouse manager was caring for a sick mother and which accounts clerk always got headaches when budgets were due because fluorescent lights triggered migraines. Arthur knew margins and market share. I knew people. And somewhere along the way, people stopped saying my name in rooms I had once helped build. At first, I told myself that was natural. Businesses mature. Roles evolve. Visibility shifts. Then little things began to catch in my mind. Arthur stopped asking me to read major announcements before he made them public. He stopped discussing board politics at dinner. He stopped saying we when he talked about the company and started saying I more often than I noticed at first. I would hear him on the phone in his study speaking with the calm authority of a man shaping history, and if I passed the doorway at the wrong moment, he would lower his voice or close the door halfway. He bought better suits. Nothing strange about that. Success changes wardrobes. Then came the cologne he never used to wear, the gym sessions at hours that made no sense, the habit of turning his phone face down at dinner, the new assistant who was mentioned just enough to sound ordinary and never enough to draw suspicion. Paige. The first time I heard her name, I barely registered it. Arthur said she was efficient and sharp and better at anticipating his needs than half the executives around him. He said it with amusement. With appreciation, the way people talk about someone competent. Months later, I would remember that moment and wonder if betrayal always introduces itself so politely. Natalie noticed changes before I did. I know that now. Daughters see things mothers are too loyal to name. She would pause sometimes in the kitchen while I poured coffee and ask whether her father had seemed distracted lately, whether he had always traveled this much, whether he was ever planning to slow down after the promotion talk became official. I answered the way wives answer when they have spent too long protecting the image of a marriage from hairline fractures. I said he was under pressure. I said growth phases are messy. I said success comes with demands. I said people always look more distant when they are tired. What I did not say is that I had begun waking at 3 in the morning and staring at the dark ceiling with a strange feeling in my chest. Not fear exactly, not yet. More like the sensation of standing in a familiar room and realizing one piece of furniture has moved in the night. You cannot see it. You just know you are going to stub your foot on something if you take one step in the dark. The night of the gala, I should have listened to that feeling. Arthur had left early that afternoon. He kissed my cheek in the kitchen while checking his watch and said the board wanted him there before guests arrived. He looked immaculate. Silver tie. Dark suit. The expression of a man walking toward the pinnacle of a life he believed he deserved. He thanked me for understanding that he had to leave ahead of me. Said he would see me there. He did not ask if I needed anything. He did not say he could wait a few extra minutes. He did not look at the gift box on the counter and wonder what was inside. I told myself not to read into it. That phrase carried me farther into ruin than any lie he ever told. The drive downtown took 23 minutes. I remember because I kept checking the dashboard clock and thinking I still had time to arrive before speeches began. I remember every red light, every reflection of street lamps on the hood, every stupid hopeful thought that crossed my mind. I imagined Arthur spotting me at the back of the ballroom and smiling the way he used to in the earliest years when my presence steadied him. I imagined people turning to look because after all these years, everyone knew I belonged there. I imagined applause, champagne, the warm press of his hand at my back. By the time I handed my keys to valet and crossed the marble lobby, I was smiling. That smile lasted less than 2 minutes. The reception desk was draped in white linen with crystal bowls full of name cards. Behind it stood a young woman with a practiced event smile and an earpiece looped neatly over one ear. I gave my name with total certainty. Eleanor Sterling. She searched the list, then searched again. Her smile faltered just a little. Not enough to alarm me at first. Just enough to make me lean forward. I spelled it for her. She checked a second set of papers, then another. Her fingers slowed. Her eyes lifted to mine and dropped again. I felt the first cold thread of worry slip into my stomach. There must be some mistake, I said. She nodded too quickly and asked me to wait a moment. She walked away and returned with a man in a tailored black suit whose expression had already settled into professional regret before he even reached me. He introduced himself as the event manager and asked my name again, as though hearing it from me personally might somehow change what was printed in front of him. I repeated it. He looked at the list, then at me. His voice was gentle in that careful way people speak when they have been instructed to remain calm, no matter what scene unfolds in front of them. He said my name was not on the approved guest list. I laughed softly because that was absurd. I told him I was Arthur Sterling's wife. I told him there had to be an error. I told him to call someone from the board if necessary because I was expected. The hesitation that crossed his face then was so small another woman might have missed it. I did not. It was not confusion. It was recognition. He knew exactly who I was. And he knew exactly who I was. And he knew exactly why I was not on that list. That was the moment fear became something heavier, something colder. Something that did not rush through me so much as settle. He reached for the radio on his belt. I asked him not to do that. I said again that there had been some misunderstanding. 2 security guards approached before he answered me. Both men looked uncomfortable. Not annoyed, not aggressive. Uncomfortable. As if they had hoped the woman causing a problem at the front desk would be someone else entirely. One of them pressed a finger to his earpiece and listened. I watched his face change by degrees. First concentration, then recognition, then something close to pity. He looked at me and lowered his voice. Arthur himself had approved the guest list. Even now that sentence does not hit me as hard as what came after. Because through the open ballroom doors I could see him. He was standing near the stage with Walter Griggs and 2 board members, champagne in one hand, the posture of a man perfectly at ease inside a room full of admiration. The lights caught the silver in his hair. Someone said something that made him laugh. I do not know what made him look toward the lobby then. Maybe instinct. Maybe timing. Maybe the fact that the universe sometimes insists on making sure you witness the exact moment your life changes. His eyes met mine across that distance. Recognition flashed instantly. He knew I was there. He knew what was happening. He knew security was standing beside me. He knew I had not caused a scene. He knew I was still standing there waiting for him to do one decent thing. All he had to do was set down his glass and walk toward me. Instead, he turned his shoulders and went back to his conversation. No shock. No apology. No gesture to pause the room. Just one clean, deliberate turn of the body that told me every truth I had not wanted to see. Those men walked me out without touching me. I remember the hush of the lobby. The click of my heels. The way nobody at the desk met my eyes as I passed. I remember the doors opening to the night air and the strange sensation that I was not embarrassed at all. I was empty. Shock can feel like dignity from a distance. I sat in my car with both hands on the steering wheel and looked up at the ballroom windows glowing above the driveway. Behind those panes of glass, people were lifting glasses to the future while I sat below them in a silk gown, holding the ruins of a marriage I had not realized was already dead. Then I picked up my phone. Charles Bennett had been our attorney for years. He knew the structure of our assets. He knew the original trust documents because he had been there when they were drafted. He was also one of the few people on Earth who had known me before Sterling Freight had conference rooms and investor decks and annual leadership retreats. I typed 5 words. Freeze the assets immediately. I stared at the screen for 1 heartbeat. Then I pressed send. Charles replied within seconds. Are you certain? I wrote back 1 word. Yes. What happened next felt unreal. Before I even started the engine, my phone lit up with Arthur's name. I let it ring. Then Charles called. Then Arthur, again. Then Walter. Then numbers I did not recognize. Calls stacked on calls until the screen seemed to pulse in my hand like something alive. I silenced it and backed out of the parking space. The gift box with the fountain pen slid gently against the leather seat as I turned the wheel. I glanced at it once at a red light and nearly laughed. That pen had been meant to mark a triumph. Instead it sat there, like evidence from another woman's life. The drive home felt longer than the drive there. Not because traffic had changed. Because memory had. Every block pulled something loose. I remembered the first apartment Arthur and I could barely afford, and how we sat on the floor eating takeout with invoices spread around us because we had no dining table yet. I remembered the night Natalie was born and how he held her with tears in his eyes, whispering that everything had meaning now. I remembered him showing me the keys to our first real office and saying we did it. I remembered holidays cut short by emergencies and anniversaries, celebrated with quick dinners, because work came first, and the countless times I accepted second place because I believed there would be a season later when all the sacrifices would make sense. Maybe that is why the humiliation at the hotel did not break me. It clarified me. By the time I turned onto our street, the question was no longer, how could he do this? The question was, how long has he been doing it? Natalie was waiting on the porch. She was still in scrubs from the hospital, her hair pulled back, her face pale in that controlled way. People go when they are trying not to unravel before you do. She stood the moment my headlights swept across the front steps. The front door was already unlocked. I knew then that someone had called her. Inside the kitchen, a glossy gala program lay on the table. Arthur's photograph filled nearly half the front fold. Beneath it, in polished lettering, were the words founder and visionary leader. There was a timeline of company milestones inside. New branches, fleet expansions, awards, strategic pivots, community initiatives. I read every line. My name was nowhere in it. Not in the early years. Not in the founding chapter. Not in the family history. Not in the section about resilience during the financial collapse that almost ended us. Not in the tribute to the values the company was supposedly built on. 34 years had been reduced to a mission. Natalie stood across from me with her hands wrapped around a mug she had forgotten to drink from. She said people at the event were already whispering. She said the board chairman had looked furious. She said several employees had seen what happened in the lobby and no one knew what to say because no one could understand why security had been told to remove me. Then she said something that changed the air in the room. Her father had been telling people for weeks that I preferred staying home, not tonight, in general. That I had no interest in public functions anymore. That I was happier out of the spotlight. That the company was his world now and mine was family and private life. A quiet exit narrative. Prepared in advance. I sat down because suddenly standing felt difficult. Natalie did not speak for a long moment. Then she said there was more. The way she said it made the room shrink. She had heard Arthur speaking backstage earlier that evening with a woman named Paige. He had said that after tonight they would not have to hide anymore. I looked at her and for a second the name meant nothing. Just a syllable drifting through shock. Then it landed. Paige. The assistant. The efficient one. The sharp one. The one who had somehow become important enough to be mentioned in passing so often she stopped sounding like staff and started sounding like weather. Always there, never remarkable until you noticed the pattern. Natalie told me she had seen them together 2 months earlier at a medical conference hotel. She had gone downstairs to meet colleagues for dinner and found Arthur in the restaurant with Paige seated beside him in a way that required no explanation. The look between them had not been professional. The intimacy had not been subtle. When Arthur saw Natalie, he followed her into the hallway and begged her not to say anything. He told her our marriage was effectively over. He told her I already understood that. He told her he was waiting until the promotion became official to handle things privately and cleanly. Privately and cleanly. Those were his words. Natalie said she wanted to tell me that very night, but he convinced her doing so would only cause pain before the timing was right. I reached across the table and took her hand. I told her none of this was hers to carry, and I meant it. Because what settled over me then was not rage, it was exhaustion. The kind that comes when you realize the hardest part of a disaster is not the blast. It is discovering how long the foundation had been cracking while you were still setting the table and folding laundry and believing love could survive neglect if only you were patient enough. Arthur finally called again around midnight. I answered. There was no concern in his voice. No shame. No attempt to ask if I was all right. He went straight to fury. Demanded to know why Charles had frozen trust activity and certain joint holdings. Demanded to know whether I understood what kind of chaos I had created during the single most important night of his career. His career. I let him talk until he ran out of momentum. Then I asked him one question. Why was I removed from the guest list? Silence. Not long. Just long enough. Then he exhaled like a man inconvenienced by having to state the obvious. He said Paige thought my presence might create an awkward atmosphere. My presence, at my husband's celebration, at the company I helped build, might create an awkward atmosphere. He said he agreed because he did not want drama on a night that required focus. He said this whole thing had already been difficult enough. He said there were conversations we had both been avoiding and that perhaps now events had forced them to happen. I asked if he was hearing himself. He asked if I had to make this ugly. That was the moment something in me went completely still. Not cold, not cruel, just still. I told him quietly that this was not drama. This was 34 years of my life, and he had treated it like a scheduling conflict. He did not answer. Maybe because there was no answer. Maybe because for the first time he heard himself through my silence instead of his own justifications. Charles called less than 20 minutes later. His tone had changed. Less reactive now, more careful, more focused. He said he had already alerted the necessary institutions to freeze certain trust movements pending review. Then he told me he had gone back through recent documentation because something about the urgency of one file had always bothered him, and tonight finally gave him reason to pull it again. 3 months earlier, a request had been filed to temporarily transfer voting authority within the Sterling Family Trust during an anticipated leadership transition. My signature was on it. Or something pretending to be. Charles said he had flagged it at the time because the handwriting looked wrong and the timing made no sense. Arthur had explained that I was stepping further back from all corporate involvement and wanted to simplify decision-making during the promotion cycle. Charles had insisted on holding execution until a final verbal confirmation from me, but Arthur's office kept pushing for completion. Then other matters intervened, and the file remained pending. I remember staring at the countertop while he spoke, at the faint scratch marks near the toaster, at a water ring beneath Natalie's untouched mug. Because suddenly the affair was no longer the worst thing in the room. This had never been only personal. Someone had been preparing to strip my voice from the very structure that protected our family assets and corporate authority. Someone had not only wanted me absent, someone had wanted me silent on paper. If I had attended the gala and smiled through the evening and returned home none the wiser, I might have woken weeks later to find decisions already made in rooms where my vote no longer mattered. Charles asked if I wanted him to begin formal legal review immediately. I said yes. He asked if I wanted discretion for the sake of family. I said no. The board convened the next morning. I slept maybe an hour before dawn. Not because I was spiraling. Because my mind had become unnaturally clear. Betrayal has a way of burning fog off the landscape. Painful clarity is still clarity. I wore a navy suit to the meeting. Simple. Severe. The kind of clothing that asks for no attention and gives away nothing. Arthur arrived looking immaculate. Too immaculate. There was a stiffness in him that had not been there the night before. Paige entered several steps behind him and took a seat near the wall rather than at the table. She looked younger in daylight, less polished, more human. That surprised me. Walter Griggs opened the session without small talk. He had known us since the company's middle years. A careful man, a political man, the kind who avoided storms until storms threatened the structure itself. He asked one direct question. One, had the primary trust stakeholder been excluded from the gala and escorted from the premises by security? Arthur launched into language about private marital complications, timing, miscommunication, personal sensitivities that should not have become corporate spectacle. Walter did not let him finish. Because Susan Whitmore, our chief financial officer, slid a folder across the table and quietly said, the spectacle might already be corporate. Inside were printouts, charges, leases, consulting invoices, travel authorizations. A luxury apartment lease under a holding arrangement tied indirectly to an outside consulting firm. Hotel charges that did not match approved business travel. Expense patterns routed through discretionary executive categories. Payments to a boutique advisory company with connections to Paige's brother-in-law. Arthur said the optics were bad, but the activities were legitimate. Susan said then he would have no objection to an independent audit. He glanced at me for the first time. I said I was requesting one. Not out of spite, not even out of suspicion alone, out of duty. That word landed harder than anger would have. Paige looked down. Walter called for a temporary vote to suspend Arthur's executive authority pending review. Arthur argued. Not loudly. Worse than loudly. Worse than loudly. Desperately controlled. The voice of a man trying to sound rational while fear climbs his spine. The vote was unanimous. I watched his face in the second after the final hand was raised. In all our years together, I had seen Arthur angry, ambitious, grateful, exhausted, triumphant, defensive. I had never seen him afraid. Until then. If the story ended there, it would already be enough for most people. But the middle of a betrayal is never clean. It is where every hidden thing starts crawling into daylight, 1 inch at a time. And daylight is patient. The handwriting expert confirmed within days that the trust document had not been signed by me, not traced by hand either. Digitally assembled from archived signature samples and printed through a system linked to a computer in the administrative suite Paige supervised. Arthur denied knowledge. Paige requested a private meeting. I almost refused. Then I said yes because by then I understood something important. People rarely tell the full truth when the room is crowded, but put enough silence around them and their own conscience begins to panic. She arrived without makeup, without the polished edge I had seen in company photos. She looked tired, younger than I wanted her to look. That felt unfair somehow. I wanted a villain. What I got was a woman who had made selfish choices and then gotten trapped inside the machinery of a much larger one. She said Arthur told her my marriage to him had been over for years in every way except paperwork. He told her I wanted distance from the business. He told her I refused public functions. He told her there would eventually be a formal separation and that certain transitional documents needed compilation from old files. She admitted gathering archived letters and forms that contained my signature. She admitted giving them to Arthur when he requested cleaner copies. She insisted she never created the forged document herself. Maybe she was telling the truth. Maybe she was cutting her guilt into the smallest pieces she could survive carrying. Then she said something I did not expect. She said she had begun to suspect the story was false months earlier because every time my name came up in executive conversations, Arthur's mood shifted from annoyance to something closer to fear. Not resentment. Not indifference. Fear. He was not trying to move on from me. He was trying to move past me before I realized he had ever been standing in front of the door. That sentence stayed with me. Fear. Not because he loved me and feared losing me, because he knew what I represented. History. Legitimacy. Legal authority. The early sacrifices no one else could document as fully as I could. The human memory of how Sterling Freight actually came into being before public relations polished it into a founder myth. He needed me absent for the same reason he needed me erased. Presence is dangerous when truth stands behind it. Around that time, the acquisition talks Arthur had been quietly entertaining resurfaced in a way I had not known about. A national logistics conglomerate had expressed serious interest in buying majority control of Sterling Freight after his promotion. He had been positioning himself not just as chief executive, but as the singular architect of the brand they believed they were buying. They requested a meeting. With me. Not him. That told me everything. When people with money smell instability, they do not chase charisma. They look for the person who still understands where the load-bearing walls are. The meeting took place in a glass conference room on the 32nd floor of a building that seemed built entirely of reflections. 3 representatives sat across from me with binders open and polite expressions sharpened by caution. They asked what terms would matter most to me if negotiations continued under new leadership. I could have asked for anything: a larger seat, a title, public recognition, control provisions, money. I asked for no layoffs for 2 years. I asked for full pension protection. I asked for guaranteed health coverage for retirees. I asked for a written prohibition against restructuring that targeted workers nearing retirement age simply because they were expensive. One of the representatives studied me for a long moment, then said those were not financial demands. I said they were the only ones that mattered enough to say first. He nodded slowly. That was the first time since the gala I felt something other than grief. Not triumph. Purpose. Arthur filed for divorce 2 days later. He also filed an emergency motion seeking temporary control over certain trust mechanisms during what his attorney described as a period of emotional volatility affecting family governance. Emotional volatility. I almost laughed when Charles read that line aloud in his office. 3 decades of records sat stacked around us. Founding papers, equity notes, original loan guarantees, early correspondence, memos in my handwriting from years when we could not afford staff, and everything important passed through my hands at some point. Arthur had spent years turning me into an anecdote while forgetting how much paper truth leaves behind. In court, he looked wounded, noble even. The devoted husband now trapped in a painful marital dispute made uglier by misunderstandings around corporate optics. Charles presented the forged signature review, the pending transfer attempt, the founding documents proving my retained authority. The judge denied the motion almost immediately. Outside the courthouse, Arthur caught up with me near the steps. There were cameras down the block because local business reporters had started circling the story by then. Not close enough to hear. Close enough to photograph. He asked me in a voice scraped raw why I was doing this to him. There are questions so shameless they become clarifying gifts. I looked at him for a long time before I answered. Then I told him the truth. I am not doing this to you. I am simply refusing to keep helping you do it to me. He had no reply. But the worst reveal came later. Not in court. Not in the boardroom. Not from Paige. From Natalie. She came by one evening after putting the twins to bed at my house and asked if we could sit outside. The air was cooling. The garden lights had just come on. Everything looked softer than it felt. She told me she had been carrying another conversation in her mind since the night of the gala and had not known whether telling me would help or harm. A few weeks before the event, she had gone to Arthur's office unannounced because one of the twins had a school performance schedule conflict, and she wanted to know if he planned to attend. The door to the adjoining conference room had been slightly open. She heard him speaking with Walter and another board member. They were discussing the promotion announcement package and possible media framing after the gala. Arthur said something then that Natalie had never forgotten. He said once the new structure is public, there will be less confusion about who really built this company. Less confusion. Who really built this company? I felt something move through me then that was worse than heartbreak. Not because it was new, because it meant this was not just infidelity or cowardice or a late-life vanity spiral fueled by a younger woman and executive praise. This was revision. He had not merely betrayed our marriage, he had started to believe his own rewritten history. Perhaps that is the final stage of certain kinds of arrogance. Not lying to others. Lying until reality itself becomes inconvenient enough that you edit it in your own mind. The audit expanded, so did the damage. Unauthorized expenses surfaced around a planned relocation package. Travel timing suggested Arthur and Paige were preparing to move long before any formal divorce filing. A consulting proposal outlined a post-acquisition advisory role for Arthur, with compensation figures that made it clear he expected to walk away elevated and protected, while I was left with whatever quiet settlement could be engineered once my authority had been diluted enough. There were nights during that period when I sat alone in the den and looked at objects that had survived our whole marriage: a brass lamp from our first apartment, the wooden bowl Natalie made in middle school, Arthur's old college photo tucked inside a side drawer because I had never bothered to remove it. I would ask myself the question everyone asks in the rubble of a long love. What was real? Did he ever mean it? Any of it? The promises? The gratitude? The tears when I sold my father's stock? The hand on my back when Natalie was born? The whispered plans? The anniversaries? The years we spent laughing at private things no one else would understand? I do not have a perfect answer, and maybe that is what makes endings like this so hard, because people are not false all at once. Sometimes they love you honestly in one decade and betray you completely in another. Sometimes the person who once needed you with reverence becomes the person who resents the witness you represent. Sometimes memory itself becomes a battleground. The board scheduled the final vote on Arthur's permanent removal 6 weeks after the gala. Those weeks dragged and flew at the same time. That is what crisis does. It steals time and stretches it until you cannot trust the calendar anymore. On the morning of the vote, I woke before sunrise and made coffee in the dark. I stood at the kitchen window and watched first light creep over the yard where Natalie used to chase fireflies, while Arthur grilled burgers on summer evenings and shouted when she ran too close to the fence. There were years in that yard. Birthdays, arguments, laughter. Ordinary sacred things. The sort of history no courtroom document can quantify and no scandal report can honor. I thought I might cry then. I did not. At the board meeting, Arthur made one final case for himself. He spoke about pressure, optics, personal mistakes, misinterpretations. He admitted poor judgment. He denied malicious intent. He called the forged signature situation an administrative failure he never personally approved, though. By then, even he seemed to know how thin that sounded. When the vote came, it was unanimous again. No applause. No dramatic gasps. Just the quiet sound of a decision entered into minutes that would outlast all of us. He was out. The room emptied in waves, papers gathered, chairs eased back. People avoided my eyes not because they blamed me, but because corporate rooms do not know how to stand near the wreckage of something intimate without pretending it is merely procedural. Arthur asked if we could speak privately. I should have said no. Instead, I followed him outside later that afternoon to the pond near the old park where we used to take Natalie when she was little. Bread for ducks. Sticky fingers. Photographs where our faces still looked open. We sat on a bench. For a while, neither of us spoke. Then Arthur said the most honest thing I had heard from him in years. He said he had fallen in love with being admired long before he fell in love with anyone else. I looked at the pond because I could not bear to look at him while he said it. He kept talking. Said success changed how rooms felt when he entered them. Said people listened differently. Said praise became easier than intimacy because praise does not ask you to stay humble. It does not remind you who held the ladder while you climbed. It does not reflect back the compromises and debts and shared sacrifices that keep glory from feeling pure. He said somewhere along the way he started to feel trapped by the old story, the real story, our story. Because it meant his greatness was never entirely his own. That sentence hurt more than the affair. Because the affair was desire. This was contempt for truth. He said he never planned for things to go this far. No one does, I suppose. People plan for comfort, for concealment, for advantage. They simply hope consequences stay abstract until it is too late. A week later, I stood on the same ballroom stage from which security had once walked me out. The company had called an all-hands event. Employees filled the room. Not in sequins and tuxedos this time. In work clothes and office wear and warehouse boots polished as best they could be. Real people. The ones who had kept wheels turning and routes running and customer calls answered while executives curated narratives upstairs. Walter stood at the podium and said the company intended to correct a mistake. Then he invited me forward. I walked across that stage in a simple cream suit. No dramatic music, no swelling sense of revenge. Only a strange, steady ache. Walter spoke about the founding years and the contributions history had failed to properly record. He said companies are not built by vision alone. They are sustained by labor that often goes unnamed, and that unnamed labor deserves more than private gratitude. Then he said my name. A room full of employees rose to their feet. The applause was immediate and overwhelming, and yet it did not feel like victory. It felt like truth finally catching up to a lie that had been allowed to breathe too long. I looked out at faces I knew and faces I did not. Drivers, coordinators, managers, receptionists, men and women who had joined long after the tire shop office and the dented truck. Some were crying. Susan was. Walter nearly was. Natalie stood at the back with her hand over her mouth. I thought I would want that moment. I thought if justice ever came, it would feel exhilarating. It did not. It felt solemn. Because recognition delayed is not the same thing as innocence restored. After the event ended, I went back to my car alone and sat there with the engine off. In the glove compartment was the fountain pen. I had never given it to Arthur. I took it out of the box for the first time since the gala. The engraving caught the light. The date looked almost absurd now. A tiny silver monument to the evening he chose public admiration over private decency. I turned the pen over in my hand, and then I did something I had not allowed myself to do since any of this began. I cried. Not neat tears, not one elegant cinematic drop. I cried the way women cry when nobody's asking them to stay composed anymore. For the years, for the humiliation, for Natalie carrying knowledge she should never have had to carry. For the younger version of myself, selling my father's stock and thinking devotion guaranteed remembrance. For every dinner I ate alone while defending Arthur's absences to people who admired him. For the simple, terrible fact that the man who once promised the world would know what I had done became the man who tried to make sure it never would. A year has passed now. My life looks nothing like it did that night in the deep red gown. The divorce is final. Quiet in the legal sense, though. Nothing about it felt quiet while we were moving through it. Paige disappeared from the company almost immediately after the investigation concluded. I heard later she moved out of state. I do not know whether Arthur went with her for any meaningful stretch, or whether that illusion collapsed under the weight of real life, when secrecy no longer dressed it up as romance. It no longer matters enough for me to ask. Sterling Freight completed a partial sale under the employee protections I demanded. The trust was restructured with clearer governance and independent oversight so no one person could ever again manipulate history into private leverage. My name now appears where it always should have. In founding materials, in archival records, in the company story told to new hires, not as an act of charity, as correction. On Wednesday mornings, I mentor women starting over after layoffs or divorces or decades spent standing in the background of someone else's ambition. We sit around a long table with coffee and notepads and tired faces, and we tell the truth about what reinvention really costs. I have watched women come in hollowed out and leave months later with their voices back. That work matters to me more than every gala I ever attended. The Sterling Family Trust funds a scholarship now. It carries both our names because I refuse to rewrite history in my favor the way Arthur tried to rewrite it in his. He was part of what we built. So was I. Truth does not become cleaner when you reverse the lie. It becomes cleaner when you stop editing. The grandsons are older and louder and full of questions. A few months ago, one of them climbed into my lap with a school project packet and asked whether it was true that I helped build a company. I told him yes. He looked up at me with that fierce, uncomplicated love children give when they still believe goodness should be obvious. Then he squeezed my hand and said he was glad I did not give up. So am I. People still ask whether I regret sending that text message. It is always strangers who ask that. People who want a neat moral. A tidy line about revenge. A declaration that justice felt wonderful and power came rushing back the moment I acted. The truth is harder. That message did not destroy my marriage. My marriage had already been destroyed in every way that mattered, long before my phone lit up in that parking garage. It ended the moment my husband decided my absence would make his success shine brighter. It ended the moment he turned away from me across that ballroom. It ended when he let another woman decide I was inconvenient to the story. It ended when he tried to move my signature without my hand. All that message did was stop the lie from advancing one step further. That is what people misunderstand about justice. Justice is not always loud, it is not always satisfying, it is rarely clean. Sometimes justice is one quiet action taken by a person who has finally run out of reasons to protect the version of events that is killing them. Sometimes it is simply the moment a woman decides she would rather face the wreckage than keep decorating the illusion. If you have ever sat in a room where your love was treated like a footnote, then you know how heavy silence can become. If you have ever watched someone rewrite your sacrifices into their legend, then you know how lonely truth can feel before it has witnesses. If you have ever been told to stay calm while your life is being rearranged without your consent, then you know strength does not always look like shouting. Sometimes it looks like walking out without trembling. Sometimes it looks like freezing assets before tears arrive. Sometimes it looks like saying yes when a lawyer asks if you are certain. And sometimes it looks like surviving long enough to hear your own name spoken correctly at last. The night security escorted me out of that ballroom, I thought I was losing everything. What I was really losing was the final illusion that love without respect can still be called love. That loss nearly broke me. It also saved me. Because once the illusion was gone, I could finally see what remained. My daughter. My grandchildren. My work. My voice. My name. My memory. My memory. My hand still steady enough to sign my own future. And maybe that is the part that hurts the most when I look back. Not that Arthur betrayed me. Not even that he tried to erase me. It is that for so many years I helped him do it by mistaking silence for grace and sacrifice for permanence. I do not make that mistake anymore, so if this story stayed with you, then stay with me for one more moment. If you know what it means to be underestimated, then subscribe. If you know what it means to keep standing after humiliation, then like this video. And if you have ever had to choose between protecting a lie and protecting yourself, then comment below with the one moment you knew you were done. Because stories like this are not only about betrayal, they are about the second after betrayal, when a person finally remembers their own worth. And if you have ever had to remember yours the hard way, then you already know. Sometimes the quietest decision changes everything. If this story stayed with you, then do not scroll away just yet. If you have ever been made to feel small in a room you helped build, then subscribe to this channel right now, because next week another woman finds her voice in a moment no one saw coming. If you have ever swallowed a truth to keep the peace, then tap that like button, so more people who need to hear stories like this can find them. If you have ever wondered whether walking away makes you weak or finally makes you free, then leave a comment below with the moment you knew you deserved better, because someone reading those words tonight is one sentence away from choosing themselves too. Turn on notifications so you never miss the next story. Share this with the woman in your life who has been quietly holding everything together for too long. And remember one thing before you go. The quietest decision a person ever makes is often the loudest turning point of their life. I will see you in the next story.